As David just said, I spent my last 20 plus years working on large scale traumatizations from what the Holocaust, racism, colonialism around the world, gender violence, and genocides. And now I'm sitting in Israel right now. So it might be just that everybody knows if there is a missile attack, I need to go for 2-3 minutes to a safe place, to a shelter. But that's very unlikely to happen in our time, but it might be, so that everybody is informed. So that leads us to how to look at leadership, leadership development, and trauma, and why and I think many others in the meanwhile, think that that's an important subject. And I will also introduce you to some of the science around trauma so that we see a little bit where our research is standing at the moment and why paying attention to the process we call trauma, because there are also many misunderstandings what trauma is and what it's not. So I want to clarify that for us and then have some time for interactions and questions. And at the same time, we will make some space for some interactions between you to reflect a bit on some of the things I'm going to present now. And so we can look at like a couple meaning the relationship between our capacities to relate to each other, our capacities to form social fabrics, and the impact that trauma has on that capacity. And so when we define for a moment what trauma is the inner response of an organism, an institution, a society, that happens when that organism goes through a strongly overwhelming experience. So when an organism goes through a strongly overwhelming experience, there is what we call the trauma response, is a very intelligent protection function, so to speak. It has developed over hundreds of thousands of years in our nervous systems and in our bodies. And so often in not fully understanding trauma, there is like a stigma that's being put on trauma, that it's something we tend to not want to talk about, but actually trauma in itself, the trauma response, not the experience we go through, what happens in us according to that experience, is actually deeply intelligent. And the more we understand its process, the more we can do certain things as leaders and do certain things as community leaders and in developing social fabrics that are very helpful in working with that original intelligence to create resilience. And I think we all want to create more personal resilience, more communal resilience, more societal resilience, because that helps us when we look at how do we define resilience. One way to define resilience is my capacity to stay related within challenging situations. My capacity to stay related to challenges, I think, is a beautiful way to describe resilience. But in order to look at why are we talking about that at all, I want to give us a brief introduction into the understanding of trauma, and then we look at how trauma and our leadership capacities, our relational and attunement capacities, maybe also our way how we create safe spaces and we help populations that are in need of support and are really struggling, how we bring all of that together into most probably everybody's daily interactions and daily life here. So as I said, when an organism, when a person or a social fabric of an institution or a community goes through a strongly overwhelming experience, we see multiple things happen in us. One is that we go through a lot of stress, and I will show you in a moment a chart that makes it visually very visible what I'm saying now. And so there is a lot of stress. We call that hyperactivation. There's a lot of activation of stress in the nervous system, and that activates fight, flight, or freeze. So either we go into a position of fighting, we go into a position of running away, fleeing, or when the stress is too escalated, we freeze. And when, so that's one set of important information. The other is that in the trauma response, there's a very intelligent function that the nervous system is so overloaded that we can package the overload or the pain and shut it down. When we shut down that pain, we can survive better. And that's true for childhood development. That's true for shock trauma in the world, in very adverse situations, wars, natural catastrophes. So the shutdown of trauma is an important mechanism to survive better. But if it's not being taken care of after, it creates a lot of symptoms in our life. So it needs to be taken care of. Otherwise, we develop strong symptoms of PTSD, for example. But only a certain amount of the population that go through traumatic experiences literally develop PTSD afterwards. Some, we call it partial PTSD, I will talk about it, and some people can integrate the shock of an adverse situation and come back to kind of an inner equilibrium. And the third, so we have hyperactivation, we have this shutdown, and we also have a third function that I think is very important, which is fragmentation. Imagine somebody takes a stone and throws it onto a window, and the glass breaks. And that fragmentation, I believe, is the beginning of feeling separate. That's the beginning of separation, societal fragmentation. That's the beginning of othering, strong othering. And so that separation, I believe, is a deep trauma symptom. And we have to also take into account that we are living in a world that was already traumatized when we were born. And I think intellectually we all know that, obviously. But sometimes we forget the implications that we grew up in a world that was already traumatized to start with. We experienced this in our parents. We experienced that maybe in the education system. We experienced this in political systems, in societies. So trauma also conditioned us. And some of the trauma symptoms, I believe, have been normalized. That's why I wrote a book on collective trauma, because through the work on the Holocaust, for example, I got to understand more and more how systemic trauma works, the trauma that lives, that directs processes in our societies, but we often call that normal. We don't call that trauma symptom. For example, strong polarization within countries, the inability to deal with differences and contradictions or different opinions, and we polarize into different groups that start having conflicts, is, in my understanding, a classic trauma symptom on a social level. But we often don't call it that way. And that's why I often say, in order to become aware of the invisible systemic trauma, we have to begin to say that when sometimes we hear people say, this is how the world is, in some aspects we need to say, no, this is not how the world is. This is how the world is when it's hurt. And if we add that sentence, then we can take care of the collective wounds. Otherwise, we normalize trauma symptoms on a systemic level. And so coming back, I will come back later to the systemic level again. I want to zoom in a bit into ourselves. Why do I speak about these symptoms and how they're important? Because often when we experience triggering moments are moments where we react versus respond. Responding means I can stay related, even if I disagree, and I'm responsive or responsible, able to respond. But when I'm reactive, when something triggers me, I see myself either overreacting, I become maybe angry, I become very stressed, and I sometimes react from that place, or I see other people becoming reactive, which might be triggering for me too. So there is an overreaction, there's a too strong reaction given the current situation. And when that happens, the current situation touches the trauma that lives inside our nervous system. That's why there's such an overstimulated reaction. But so that's often what we call triggered. But there's another form of being triggered, which is that when for some of us, being triggered means that I become numb, that I stop feeling myself, that I become a bit distant, that I become a bit more indifferent, and that I actually pull out of the relationship in a current situation. So some people, when they get triggered, they become more hyperactivated. Some people that get triggered actually become more quiet and disrelated. But both of them are functions of our trauma area in ourselves. And I will show you one chart that I think describes that well. Soon share. I need maybe, yeah, okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So this is like somebody that I collaborate with also at times, Steve Porges. He's a professor at a US university, and he developed what maybe some of you heard already, the polyvagal theory. So this is a chart of our autonomous or central nervous system. And it shows, as you can see, where you see this wave and the green, between the green and the red area, you see a wave pattern. Of course, every one of us will experience stress during the day, and regular stress or creative stress is also part of us being active, getting things done, and responding to challenges. But what we call a regulated nervous system has the capacity to experience increased stress levels and be able to relax again. When that function works well, we can be more stressed, we have stressful phases in our life, and we can relax that stress, and it, for example, doesn't affect our sleep. It doesn't affect our daily interaction, that we become shorter with people, that we become more pressured, because I can regulate my nervous system. And so what we call social engagement is, there is a system, the frontal part of our nervous system is the part when we say our heart is open. When we say our heart is open, the frontal part of our vagal nervous system is relaxed or is activated, and that creates enough relaxation that we can be in a felt connection with each other. We are open, we are curious, we are compassionate, we are mindful, we feel joy, we are present. All of these are functions of when our social engagement system is open. When you see the kind of the hill, the activation into the sympathetic nervous system, the higher that activation level goes, we become worried, frustrated, anxious, irritated, depending if we go into fight or flight mode. We become angry, enraged, or panic. We feel panic. And when our stress level exceeds a certain level, then we freeze. So the highest escalation of stress is usually in people that don't speak anymore about stress, that are frozen. When we see, and I have worked here also here in Israel with people that were very traumatized from the current situation, and we could really see how when their system is in a shutdown, then it seems like on the surface people are still talking and functioning, but actually their nervous system is very frozen. So freeze is the highest escalation of stress. Fight and flight is one notch down. And then is our social engagement, which means we are creatively stressed and relaxed. And in the relaxation mode, our body has its best self-healing function. We recharge our battery, we recuperate in the night when we sleep. We can be in relaxed conversations. We are at our best at problem solving, finding solutions, being inspirational, being innovative. All these functions are kind of at their best when we are in the social engagement zone. Okay, so we can send this also around if that's interesting so that you can come back to that. I will come back now. So that tells us a bit about when we feel grounded, because grounding is a function of relaxation. Like at the beginning meditation that Sandra led, when you feel your feet, and you can not just imagine your feet, but you can really feel how your body is open, warm, grounded, connected to the ground. These are all functions of the parasympathetic nervous system being active enough to feel relaxed. When we are relaxed, we have enough inner space to be reflective. We can be contemplative, reflective. We can digest our experience. A lot of trauma healing is digesting the experiences that we could not digest in those overwhelming moments. And when digestion happens well, like with our food, when we eat food, we digest food, and what happens afterwards? The food is being integrated into the body. And the same happens in our psyche. When we can digest our experience, and I'm sure here we have also a lot of contemplative skill, that when we are contemplative, reflective, and we can digest our experience, we integrate that as post-traumatic learning, or we integrate it as learning without trauma. So digestion leads to integration, and integration leads to a growth of perspective and the growth of wisdom. And so when my nervous system can relax enough and is regulated enough, those functions are my natural rhythm. When I carry chronic trauma in my system, then I operate on higher stress levels, maybe chronically, because I got used to that. And then certain functions are not that easy. And the digestion is not that easy. My sleep maybe is not that easy and gets disturbed. That's a sign that there's a lot of stress. When I'm overthinking, that is stress in my body. So when my mind is racing, I don't need to calm my mind. I need to regulate the stress in my body. Because when my stress level drops, my mind naturally becomes more quiet, which is, of course, very helpful for any kind of contemplative practice. And so this is a beginning of a short overview. Of course, trauma is a very big subject, but I want us to remember hyperactivation, a lot of stress, but also numbing, becoming absent, not feeling oneself anymore, especially if we are working with a lot of people that experience a lot of trauma. One way to cope with it is to numb ourselves. But then after a long day, we actually notice that we dealt with the exposure to pain by becoming a bit more numb, by becoming a bit more distant, by pulling away from the relationships because it's too much. And that's okay, but that's something that we can become more aware of. What is my tendency when I get triggered? And maybe one more subject, and then we let it rest a bit, that it's not too overwhelming, too much information at once. Of course, when we look at trauma in our work, we are looking at individual, ancestral, and collective trauma. And I will say in a moment what I mean by that, or individual, intergenerational, and collective trauma. Some people associate trauma with war, soldiers, car accidents, or other adverse situations like violence, which certainly is true. And that's why some people say, oh, I'm not traumatized, I didn't experience something like that. But in fact, there's another whole section of trauma that's the way we grew up as children. There's a whole section of attachment trauma that happens because our attachment process, we are very social beings. Our nervous system is so socially wired that many things that are overwhelming for very small children are hurting the social engagement system. And that's why attachment trauma is an important aspect of understanding trauma, because that's when we all get wired for life, and that there might be trauma in our attachment process that causes higher stress levels, some of the trauma symptoms in our lives, is important to understand and not to disregard as, oh, I never experienced the war, that's why trauma is only for people that experience that. No, that's not true. And since we have been working a lot also in contexts where a massive trauma impact, for example, like the Holocaust or 400 years of slavery and racism in the US or in other places, we also looked deeply into intergenerational trauma. And for example, we are working with or collaborating at times with a professor for epigenetics. And actually in our organization, with one of our training programs, we are running an epigenetic study ourselves right now. We can already, this professor at the Zurich University can show in mice experiments, when there is an attachment traumatized mouse, a pup that has been separated from the mother for enough time and carries some attachment trauma from that event, 5 or 6 generations later, the offspring of that mouse has the same trauma symptoms, but has never been traumatized. They didn't experience attachment trauma, but they show higher stress levels, higher anxiety levels, higher trauma symptoms, but they didn't experience the attachment trauma themselves in the same way like the original mouse. So, and they can show that in the sperm cells of mice, there are epigenetic changes that are being transmitted from generation to generation. So it's not only what we experience in our own biography, it's also what's being handed over by the former generations that already encodes for trauma in our bodies. And I think that's important because some people wonder, okay, I didn't go through a strongly adverse situation, but I show some of the symptoms in my life. And yes, of course, there already scientific evidence. And I think maybe in wisdom traditions, there is much more knowledge in a different way about the same understanding. And so the intergenerational trauma transmission is important and needs to be taken in account, especially if we talk about recurrent trauma symptoms, because trauma, as Sigmund Freud in Vienna already beautifully said, that trauma, unresolved trauma, is subject to the repetition compulsion. Unconscious trauma repeats itself. There's a repetition compulsion to trauma. We can see this in our own patterns, things that we experience over and over again in form of thoughts, behaviors, interactions, relational dynamics, people that trigger us. But we see this also in between generations, that certain suicidality, mental health issues, other health issues are recurrent throughout the generations. And we see it obviously in cultures that similar wars and conflicts are resurfacing again and again and again. So that's the repetition compulsion of trauma. And so I said enough, I think, about trauma. I want to also give us a space for questions. But before I do that, on the other hand, though, and that's very important, we all, I believe, are the remedy. We all are the remedy. And the remedy is very much concentrated in some of the capabilities and some of the inner states that we can access to serve the healing of trauma and to stop the repetition compulsion of trauma, so that we literally create the bigger world together than the one that we found when we were born. And one aspect is faith. There are studies that say faith is a tremendous resource for people dealing with trauma. The second one is, or faith and presence. Presence is a very strong quality that we can bring into a room, either with ourselves, obviously, but also when we are in leadership positions, when we work with a lot of communities. Being present is a very powerful function. At the same time, I believe it's very important to understand that in the traumatic moment, life says, here in space and time, it's not good for me. Here in space and time, life is not good for me. For a child that experiences adversity, for a person in a war zone where there's violence. So not being present is actually not a shortcoming. Not being present is an intelligent function in adverse situations. Not feeling one's body, shutting down one's emotions, retracting from the relationship that is traumatizing is intelligent in the adverse situation. Because many people struggle with the moments when they cannot be present, and becoming more present becomes sometimes even like a bit of an effort. Instead of learning to understand the forces of not being present, making that intelligence my ally, and collaborating with it to come back into life. Because today I'm not anymore in the same adverse situation. So we can support each other when we make not being present our ally versus our shortcoming. And that's true for all trauma symptoms, that actually the trauma symptoms in our life are all intelligent functions, the intelligent defense mechanisms. And if I work with it through love and compassion and deeper understanding, healing is much more easy. So it's a non-pathologizing, non-stigmatizing way to address trauma. So I said, one strong resource is faith, the other one is presence, and another one that we all carry is relating. And the basic building block of relationships is I feel you and I feel how you feel me. I feel you and I feel how you feel me is the basic building block of two nervous systems creating a synchronized space between each other, or with a group, for group facilitators or people who work with communities. I feel you feeling me. In neuroscience, that function is called neuroception. And I feel you feeling me is the basis for psychological safety. In any context, if we want to bring more safety into a room, I feel you feeling me. Even if you don't feel me, but I feel you, feeling felt is registered in the nervous system as, oh, it's safer. Because we can't hurt each other when we feel each other. And we know this for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years as nervous systems, that when we feel felt, we are safer. When we don't feel felt, it's a bit more unsafe, insecure, less grounded. So, and practicing I feel you feeling me is also one of the major interventions in reducing the trauma impact. And another friend of mine, she's a professor at the Johns Hopkins University for Public Health. She's in the US, one of the trauma experts also on childhood trauma mostly. And so there is, in her studies, she is part of what some people might have heard as the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experience studies that have been done over decades. And there is already a clear correlation between childhood trauma. The more childhood traumatizations we carry, the more likely it is that we develop health issues when we are grown-ups. So there's already a correlation between mental and physical health and trauma. And they studied ACEs, and what she calls PCES is like positive childhood experiences. And they can show that if somebody is going through an adverse or very challenging situation and has positive relational experiences in the adverse moment or short after, the after effects of trauma are being reduced a lot. So what we all can contribute is positive relational experiences have immediate impact on the kind of trajectory that that person is on, and how many after effects of the trauma will manifest in that person's life. So love, compassion, presence, relational resonance, I feel you feeling me, creating safe spaces, listening to each other deeply. All these capacities are great interventions to reduce the after effect of trauma. And then, of course, in our own work with ourselves, we call this in the trauma work resources that we all, especially when we work in communities that are very overwhelmed, traumatized, in adverse situations, we have to make sure that we ourselves feel what resources us, and that we also know how to guide or support people to find their own resources, inner resources. This can be nature, this can be feeling our body well, this can be music, this can be prayer or contemplative practices, this can be many things, relationships, safe spaces. Um, and so that we know how to come back to a state of presence and centeredness when we feel disturbed, triggered in our life. And of course, that there is training and integration, which means I can learn more about my inner trauma structure, that I cannot just, some of it I can train, and some of it I need to integrate in order to grow. And both together, I think, are an amazing practice. So yes, I want to let that sink in or drop in a bit, and then see maybe we can develop some of it through more specific questions that are maybe also more specific in your context where you're working and where you're affecting culture or organization. And but before we do that, as I said before, when trauma is in the room, we often feel that there is not enough space, that there is not enough time. And so making space, slowing down, having space for reflection are important qualities. When we see there's dysregulation, when we see the context is getting harder to soften, because speeding up and getting tighter are two ways of reducing the intensity of experience, what we feel. So sometimes slowing down and softening the way we feel ourselves, the way we guide other people to be with themselves, is a way to reconnect to oneself, to feel again one's center, one's purpose, one's inner connection, one's ground, one's body. And what is very helpful in that regard, but I think many of us know that our breath is an amazing regulation tool when we want to regulate our nervous system ourselves, slowing down our exhalations, exhaling a bit slower and a bit longer, even while we are in conversations or when we are contemplative or when we have a moment time, is very helps our nervous system to relax a bit more. So exhaling a bit slower, a bit longer for multiple times changes the equilibrium in my nervous system from stress to relaxation. So these are important aspects. And maybe the last thing is, when trauma is in the room, there's always a bit or a lot of scarcity. Something is not enough. There's not enough safety. There's not enough relational support. There's not enough money. There's not enough emotional availability. There's not enough time. But once I notice that, then I see, oh, scarcity is a function of individual or systemic trauma. So being generous when it's scarce brings more energy into the room, brings more resources into the room. And that's why in the bottleneck, when we feel like we are in a bottleneck because it's tight, it's too much, slowing down, opening up and being generous and giving is a tremendous remedy for scarcity. So, yes, great. So I would love to see if there are any questions. I know it's a lot of material for an hour. I see you're very concentrated and patient with it. So I want to open a bit the space and see if there is any if there are any questions that we can refine, and then we will take it into a practice after that. Yes, I'm happy that you bring that in. So what I was describing are the fundamental trauma symptoms or sets. And on top of that, we all create strategies or survival or strategies of behavior that help us to navigate in a social context, often based on this underlying trauma symptoms. And one would be that pleasing, for example, is a way not to feel fear. If I lean in too much, I start eating the resources of my own body. And so if giving is on the expense of my body, then it's something to look at. If giving is coming out of my center, then it's amazing. Then it's truly generous. Then it's true. And then it's a never-ending fountain because it's connected to our inner connectedness. And if it's coming from the center, then it's fantastic. But we need to be able to discern and also support sometimes people that feel too much leaning in is depleting our inner resources, and especially then when we work in very challenging environments or environments where many people are traumatized, then all the things that we might hear, that we might be exposed of, we start to collect a lot of secondary trauma effects in our bodies, so we get depleted. And that's something we really have to take care of, because we want to do the work that we do for many decades with love and compassion, and we need to see where a certain behavior is also like a survival strategy or a coping strategy, and that will hurt our resources. That's why often I say, like, we want a sustainable world, but trauma in itself or traumatic stress, when we carry trauma inside, it's like as if the baseline stress level is here. And so we are operating on a higher stress level, which means we are burning more inner resources. So, and in a dysregulated world, or also in dysregulated institutions, we are not building a sustainable society because many of us carry traumatic stress inside. So that we might see this in economy, how we deal with natural resources, but we are often dealing like with the same resources in our body, because my body is also nature. My body is also resources. And so what you're saying is a very important subject. And often we see that these strategies are actually built on trauma, stress, fear, chronic anxiety, and it helps us actually to balance something, which true giving is not an inner balancing. It's coming out of a fountain inside that that is actually, that can give and replenish itself. That's what we call regulation. Yeah. Does that speak to your comment or question? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks, Thomas. We've got a couple of questions that we've gathered in the chat, and some of them overlap a bit. One is a very practical question from the perspective of the person who's in a leadership role and may have identified a situation where a person is manifesting symptoms of trauma. And Lisa asks, how do you stay engaged but know when you're in a position where you might need to refer this person beyond yourself? So how does the leader exercise responsibility around that boundary and knowing their limits?
Yeah. Because I supervise a lot of coaches, consultants, and therapists, I often say a difficult client lives always in us. The difficult client is never out there. And in a way, the answer to the question lies in that sentence. So if I experience a challenging situation with somebody that expresses a lot of trauma symptoms, but I feel there is an ongoing progress, there's a movement, then it's okay. It's okay that I don't feel all the time comfortable with somebody, but I feel that I'm managing to be in a progressive relationship with that person. If I feel we are in a trauma loop, that we are developing similar conversations, similar behavioral symptoms again and again, or I feel that I become defensive with that person, then I think it's important to say that I need to bring in some other resources or some support that is more skilled to deal with that set of symptoms than I am. And that's actually very responsible. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength to know when to bring somebody in that can deal with that specific situation differently. And I think that's very trustworthy. If I know my limits, that's very trustworthy.
Thank you. Thanks. We have a similar principle in spiritual direction, as well as in the wider field of coaching, and to acknowledge that the person coming to us often is a reflection of some inner work we need to be doing and going through ourselves. Thank you. So, and there's a few questions that are related to the pathway of healing for the kind of trauma that is experienced in childhood, including around attachment. If you could offer a sort of a description of a healing pathway that you would say is kind of in some ways a pattern that's helpful for people who have experienced childhood trauma, what would it look like?
Yeah, what it looks like is, first of all, that I believe self-honesty and humility are two important functions on our path. And that means that I can see, yes, there are symptoms in my life, and I don't just label those symptoms. First of all, they shouldn't be there. Secondly, I should get rid of them, because getting rid of something is the same function that trauma did to start with. So if I want to get rid of my fears, it means I don't live in relationship to my fears. I see my fears as a disturbance, not as a part of me, because many people wouldn't say, I want to get rid of my liver. And then we say, of course, you don't want to get rid of it. But why, of course? Why the liver, of course, and the fear? Oh, yeah, the fear we can get rid of. The fear is also part of me. And the relationship to the fear is either cut, then it's like a disturbance that I can get rid of. But that's already a sign of childhood trauma often, that early fears are overshadowing my life. And so the second part is, we don't try to get rid of things, we are trying to integrate those into our development. And that's why we often, when there is childhood trauma, it's very helpful to be able to have some relational support that can help me to access not just my symptoms, because the fear is also a symptom, if, for example, if it's recurrent fears, but helps me to contact the part of not being relationally supported. And here's an example. So let's say when my daughter comes to me and says, Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared. And so there are two options, or there are many options, but I will say two. One is I say to my daughter, oh, don't be scared. There is nothing dangerous here. So what did I do? I devalued the emotion of my daughter, because she tells me clearly I'm scared. And I tell her, don't be scared. Sometimes we don't be scared. But that's not helpful to her because she stays more isolated with her fear. And then I answer her emotional request with a rational answer. There is nothing dangerous in the house, for example. So what happens? My daughter stays with the charge of stress and fear, but more isolated. There is another intervention or another response, and I think that's also a great leadership response, that when she comes, Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared, that I turn to her, I feel her, I say, yes, I feel you're scared. Come to me. Come to me. I bring her closer. Maybe I embrace her. And I say, yes, I feel you're scared. In that moment, when I say that, I confirm her fear. I say, yes, I feel your fear. So you're not alone with your fear. I feel it too. That creates a mutual emotional landscape. What that does for my daughter is that her nervous system feels felt. My nervous system and her nervous system create a unit that helps her nervous system to downregulate her stress, her fear. And then I say, okay, let's have a look what just happened. Then I bring in rational leadership. I bring in parental leadership, but not by devaluing the emotion, but by actually honoring the emotion. And that's, I think, because if I am stressed anyway, and I have a lot of things to do, and I don't have enough time, and then it's much easier to say, oh, don't be scared, there's nothing. But actually, it says that I am not in the space to receive her fear. I feel it a bit as a disturbance. Because if I am open, and anybody that comes to me with fear, with anger, with shame, with sadness and grief, great. Because my emotional system can immediately feel that emotion, be in resonance with that emotion, and allow a co-regulation to take place. And that's why, that's, for example, one point where in my work I got to understand, wow, we are living in a world where emotions have been defined as over individual properties. It's your fear, it's my fear, instead of emotions being shared landscapes. Fear in empathy or compassion is a shared space. It's not just a personal property that belongs to one individual. In compassionate communities, emotions are the connective tissue, the connecting tissue of life. It's the color of life. It's the water that nourishes the land. When our body is the land, emotions are the water. And so that is also important when we work with people, either in our leadership positions in communities, that feeling felt is actually a tremendously powerful function to create trust, to create co-regulation. And I believe the fact that we experience sometimes emotions as isolated and personal properties is already a sign of a collectively traumatized world. And so in childhood trauma, why I'm saying all of this, because that's a bit the context. Many of us that might not have experienced that level of co-regulation, or often the opposite, like being devalued for our emotional needs, being devalued for the way we experience life, or being neglected, or experiencing violence in our child time, that all are traumatizing events, especially for a very young nervous system that actually needs a mature nervous system to learn to regulate itself. When my daughter is 3, her nervous system cannot stay alone with that fear and that stress in a healthy way. It needs a mature nervous system so there's a mature nervous system. I need co-regulation to develop regulation. And that also means that when my parents regulate me well, or co-regulate with me well, that I feel regulated, I learn that the world is a safe place, except there is real danger. But for some people, the world is chronically a bit of an unsafe place. That's a sign of early attachment fear. And that's why when we work with attachment trauma, we often need a counterpart, like somebody that helps us to develop the vitamins that we've never got. And once that's developed, we can continue with our own practice and do the rest. But sometimes a trauma symptom is trying to do it alone, because that's how often we felt. We felt alone and we needed to do it alone. But being alone in a connected, unified world is a trauma symptom, not a reality. And so I think that's a bit of a frame. I needed to expand a bit on that, but I think these are important principles that I think also in leadership, when people come to us and they are stressed, investing 2 minutes in feeling them, listening to them, say, yes, I hear you, I feel you are stressed. And even in a collectively traumatized world, when I need to ask you what you feel, I believe that's already a collective trauma symptom. Why do we need to ask each other how we feel? Why don't we feel how we feel? How other people feel? If my own emotional system is open, I feel when the person next to me is sad, when the person is afraid. I can ask it as a kind of a more therapeutic intervention to create reflection in the person. That's helpful. But if I ask it because I don't feel it, then it's something that I need to look at in myself, I believe. And the last part to that is also that it's very important that we notice when people are overwhelmed, we often feel numb ourselves. I cannot tell which emotion I feel. And when I ask another person, say, wow, what's your current emotion? And the person says, yeah, I feel that I feel good. No, an emotion is, I feel fear. I feel afraid. I feel joy. I feel angry. I feel a bit of sadness. When we connect it to our emotion, we can say it immediately. If we need to search for the emotion, it means we don't feel the emotional system, which is okay. But it's also okay to just say that. I don't know. I don't feel myself right now emotionally. And then this helps me to, from the numbness, to come back to a sensing. And I think in childhood trauma, or in every trauma, basically, we see that the mental function, the emotional function, and the physical function is not synchronized. They are not saying the same thing. And I think we are used to live in a world where we can read books about development, but we are actually not developing. And we say, oh, yeah, that's how it is. I can read a book about trauma, but it doesn't help me. It just gives me more knowledge. Why? Because the information in formation doesn't fully go in. It doesn't embody itself. So I'm not being fully informed cognitively, emotionally, physically. And so every time the body says A, and that's also important for everybody who is in a leadership function, because when the body, the emotions, the mind say one message that's authentic, that's trustworthy, and it transmits one message into the space. When I feel A, but I say B, I transmit 2 messages into the space. And everybody who's listening to me needs to handle my attention. And that's very important for everybody who speaks publicly, who gives talks. If I'm a bit scared to speak publicly, and I try to suppress my fear and my stress and speak anyway, that goes out with the information that I want to share into the audience. And consciously or unconsciously, the audience needs to handle that, which makes it a bit harder to listen. When my body, my emotions, my mind express the same thing, it's much easier to listen. That's why we call it authentic. And that's why authentic leadership is trustworthy, because I feel in my body what you say and what I hear is the same.
Mm.
And that's beautiful. And often childhood attachment trauma work helps us to bring that flow back, that the nervous system becomes again a flow, like a fountain, physically, emotionally, mentally. And then it's sense making.
Mm.
Cognition and sensing is sense making. It makes sense. Sorry. It's very clear, and I'm very happy you bring that in, because you described very beautifully how we start to pathologize the parts of us that are traumatized. And I think one thing you mentioned is that in the moment you relate to the part that seems dysfunctional, and you begin to listen to that part, you begin to say, yes, I'm here, I'm open to connect to my fears, I'm open to feel my stress, I'm open to feel maybe the parts of my body that I don't feel so well. That all this positive attention is actually exactly what we need. And then when that part is active, when another person comes to us with similar things, we feel shorter because we cannot fully receive the person because we carry a similar part inside. So then if we do this with ourselves, we also become more open, more loving, more able to listen, more able to resonate with other people that carry these kind of topics in themselves. And we can help people to say, wow, the pathologizing of the dysfunctional parts is exactly what trauma does. Trauma shuts down and fragments a part in the body and the nervous system. So there's a part of the body that we feel less. There's a set of emotions that we need to shut down. There's a set of stress. And so getting rid of it is actually what happens in the traumatic moment. And the reenactment of that is that we want to get rid of that part of ourselves as grown-ups as well, which is just replaying the original trauma story. And once I get that, I say, oh, wow, me trying to get rid of difficulties is exactly the same process that created that part in the first place. And the remedy is a more loving, a more compassionate, a more listening, a more kind of stress sensitive and regulatory function that I developed. That when I feel stress, I can embrace my stress, I can connect to my breathing, I can connect to my body, I learn to ground stress in my body, and so on. All of that is also what we want to pass on to other people, because they might do in themselves the same thing with their self-critical thoughts, with their self-judgments, with their all the parts in themselves where we think we are actually not okay. And then the body begins to reveal, even in the solar plexus, as you said, and the reflex that you have, that's a lot of stress that has never been heard. And the second part is, when we look at trauma, we see the social engagement system, when we are frozen, is shut down. So when we touch our trauma, and in the work that we do on trauma, it's a deeply relational trauma work. So we see when somebody says, I'm scared, often we see that their relational system is actually pulled back. So the person feels isolated when scared. So, and then sometimes even the attention from another person can't be registered inside as support, because we don't feel the relationship fully. And until we learn to feel, oh, when I say I'm scared, the other person feels that too. And not just that I know that I can feel that again. That's part of the deep healing, that I see, wow, when I say I'm scared, the other person feels my fear. That's usually when the trauma resolves, or part of the trauma layer begins to resolve. And then the stress in the body can be released. And I saw this thousands of times. It's amazing how really supportive relationships, I feel you feeling me. And then we often feel when people talk about their trauma, they actually feel isolated in themselves. And when we bring positive attention to that and awareness, and the person becomes aware of themselves, so then it creates a re-engagement in the relationship. And that's how the trauma can be released into the collective intelligence, into relationship. So I'm very grateful that you brought that up. And I think it's a great example how to change one's mindset also from pathologizing those parts to becoming curious about these parts. Yeah. Is that good for now? So we can go to some of the other questions. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah. And I think also on the community level is when somebody in the community shares something, we are all the resonance body, like with a guitar. You are the string, and we all, when we listen to you, we are the resonance body, and together we create music. And so the resonance, how the community holds somebody who is sharing, when we feel the fear that you spoke about, the stress you spoke about, this is already healing. This is already a deeper relationship. So thank you. So maybe we do one collective question and then we can go into some practical sharing. David.
Okay. On the collective level, Thomas, it's apparent that there are a couple of questions here related to how congregations support members within a community, or even wider in the congregation as a whole, to form some kind of supportive accompaniment that may not be psychological counseling, but in the way that you're describing, still provides these safe regulating spaces where people can create this sort of attunement for one another. What would that look like, practically speaking?
Yeah. Yeah, practically speaking, it comes down to a few competencies that I think are very important to train, and maybe many here are already trained in some form. Maybe you call it differently. One is that I feel that stress is viral and presence or regulation is also viral. What that means is when I connect to somebody that is very stressed, let's say we work in a war zone and somebody is very stressed, then it might, when I'm also a bit stressed, then it might enhance my stress. So I'm getting also more stressed and it's an uncomfortable situation. But if I'm very regulated, I can feel somebody who is stressed without getting stressed myself, and then the person can come down. So one competence to develop is how can I live a life and be in an equilibrium inside that I can be more co-regulative in my environment. And so presence, regulation, connection start to spread around me, become ecosystemic. And so that's one thing but it also means that I need an inner practice. For example, I ground myself regularly. I learn to notice my own stress level. I can use my breath as a grounding tool to down regulate my nervous system. I have a contemplative or prayer practice as everybody has here, I guess, so that there is the faith is a deep regulation practice as well. So I have different levels of regulating myself, and like that I bring that capacity into spaces. Then having some basic psychoeducation that we can spread, how people can do that for themselves and help them to practice that so that they can begin to feel the benefit, especially in crisis areas, having a few self-regulation techniques like I just described, and being able to install small community circles of resourcing so that people can be together and support each other through listening. And that we have in crisis areas, I think we need ecosystemic layers of resourcing, so that every time there are people that work with very stressed communities, have circles where they can go to resource themselves, to bring the resource to that circle. So circles within circles within circles. And so like that, we bring resources from areas in the world or from people that have more to give at the moment to areas that are more stressed or hurt, and resource local communities through an international resourcing system. And I think here is an amazing infrastructure already in place that can provide that. And so the ecosystemic aspect, self-regulation, co-regulation techniques to build local competence. We often say we are working a lot with individual competence building, like professional competence building, and collective competence building, and that we want to invest in both. And the collective competence building is self-regulation techniques, co-regulation techniques, how we listen to each other, how we co-regulate, like people learn to co-regulate with each other, and how we create systemic awareness. That, for example, when I look now at the screen, I can look at one person, but I can also look at the group. I can feel one person. So for example, Virginia, I see here. When I feel Virginia, I can feel her nervous system, her body, her life. But I can also open my sensing and develop systemic sensing. So I feel the group and the quality of the group, the cohesion, the presence, the fragmentation, whatever. And systemic sensing has a grounding impact on the system. So contemplating and sensing a system, a group, a community also has a co-regulative function, but on a different level. And so our nervous systems are constantly communicating with each other. We just need to train those skills. And I'm sure many here do that anyway, through compassion and connecting and deep relating. So all of these elements are co-regulating communities in crisis. And we know that faith, there are studies that have been done on community resilience, that faith and building functional relationships in crisis areas are the two strongest resilience factors for very stressed communities or very impacted communities. I hope that speaks a bit to it. We can maybe speak afterwards more, otherwise we don't have any time for a little bit of exploration. Maybe if we want to transition to one triad, and then we will have some more Q&A time afterwards. And I would love to explore two things. So one is, I spoke about triggers. We get triggered, which means we overreact in situations because prior traumatized parts in us get activated through a special situation. And I'm curious, when you reflect on what are triggers that you know already about, and you can speak about a bit with your peers, how that shows up. Because as I said, one set of triggers is that I feel a rush of energy. Maybe I'm getting very stressed in a situation. I might become more activated and angry, and or scared. So fight and flight. So what do I experience more often? I pull out, or I go more in. And the second set of symptoms is I become numb, or a bit distant, indifferent, and I pull out of relationship. And so this set of symptoms, I think would be good to explore. How do I experience it? And just to speak about it as honestly as possible, that we get some chance to listen to each other. And also that the two people who are listening are just providing a listening and I feel you feeling me space. It's not about giving each other good advice. It's more about being with each other here. And the second question would be, how do I meet trauma symptoms in my leadership function? And what are the areas where I feel challenged as a leader, maybe through trauma symptoms? So where do I meet that? And how do I feel challenged? And again, as honestly as possible, not because the challenge is a shortcoming, because the challenge is a learning opportunity. I believe every challenge is an opportunity for us to grow if we want to take it that way and we make space for the learning. So we don't try to rush, but we actually slow down for a moment. And I think if we have present partners to listen to us, so maybe we will by ourselves surface some new insights about those challenges given what we learned today. So maybe a trigger and a leadership challenge that you are facing in relationship to trauma. And that every person has 8 minutes. Maybe we can give a minute to come in and introduce yourself to each other. And then we give you, if possible, 1 or 2 minutes to fade out, that you don't feel pulled out of the triad, but that it's a smoother transition.
Just to gather up some of those questions that were in the chat prior to our triads, one of the questions which came from Anna was around this question of how trauma can lead us to form structures of identity, structures that are resilient and hard to, in a sense, outgrow and leave behind, and which may be causing probably more suffering, even as they're also filled with coping mechanisms for us. Thomas, could you say something about how we live with, work with, coach those who have formed a kind of personality in response to their trauma, which may be filled with opportunity for liberation and further growth and opening of channels? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yes, so let's look at so when trauma happens, a tremendous impacted an organism, but it can also be, of course, an organization, a community. And so every coping mechanism is per definition more effort than the original authentic self-belonging regular flow of life. So every coping mechanism and every structure or identity structure that arises out of it is more effortful. That's one thing. The other thing is good to see that trauma can be seen like an iced over river or like a permafrost, which means on the one hand, we don't feel anymore the flow of life where we carry trauma inside. We are walking on ice, but we are not getting wet from the water of the river. We don't feel life anymore as flowing through us. So that's why we need to put more effort into sense making and understanding life. And one way is to over mentalize life, like the part that we can feel, we need to think about more. So every compensation is actually a more effortful way to bridge something that can't be done on the direct way. Either my body feels your body, and then I feel the stress in your body, I feel the tension patterns in your body, it's open. Or I need to start to analyze your body language. So I translate what my body can do directly through my mind. Or the same is with emotion. I can try to understand emotions or I feel them. Emotional intelligence is being in resonance emotionally, not to know a lot about emotions. And so what I'm saying is like the identity structures that are built on more effort also lead to facts like overworking becomes a way to feel safe or to belong, because the natural belonging is hurt or the natural safety is hurt. So we see there's chronic effort in trauma structures that are compensation mechanisms. And the other part is that I often say that's individually true, but also systemically true. The trauma structures in our societies, for example, are non-emergent, are disrelated, are colder, are talking about versus talking from. And healthy structures in individuals and organizations and communities are emergent, which means they keep updating themselves. So the update is built into emergent structures. So that it always has a future. It always keeps developing. It stays creative. It stays innovative. It's relational. It's agile. It can grow with the evolutionary needs. It can detox the structures that are not necessary anymore and build new ones. Trauma cannot do that. That's why a systemic trauma often breaks open with a crisis. It's like when there's so much water pressure on the wall, onto the wall, that the wall breaks. So conflicts are often the only way to open up a system that is so not developing that it needs a conflict to break it open, which is, of course, often more destructive and creates new trauma. And so non-emergent structures in ourselves, in people we work with, in institutions we work with, are repetitive, cyclic structures that are not changing. If I have the same difficulty again and again, I know I'm in my own trauma area. If I get triggered by similar people again and again, if I have similar conversations or conflicts again and again, that's a non-emergent structure. And so we can read those signs and we can work with them in order to melt the trauma so that the river can be liberated. Mm-hmm. And another thing that connects to it, especially for people that accompany people or coach people, because before we talked about the attachment process, for example, there are two people that are coming to my office. Both of them come with panic attacks. So it looks like they're suffering from fear. But one person that was, for example, hospitalized as a 6-month-old child without the parents being able to stay in the hospital with the child. That's an existential crisis at a very early level of development, and that creates a lot of fear. And that fear has a certain quality. When somebody, for example, was bullied a lot at school at age 12, that person also experiences fear. They both come to me and say, I'm scared. But they are both talking about something else. They are not talking about the same level of fear. So I, as somebody that accompanies people, need to change the way I connect to that first person. I need to modulate my nervous system differently than to the second person if I want to be very specific in the treatment. So fear is not just an emotion. Fear has a whole spectrum of fears, and it depends what kind of fear are we talking about. So it's very specific and sophisticated. Same with other emotions. And the more that's why I often say specificity is love, because when we can become very specific, we bring some universal love into a very specific context. Mm. And that is, I think, very precise in the relating process. That's why I wrote my last book is called Attuned. I deeply believe that that level of sophisticated attunement, how we feel each other and how we use the capacity of our nervous systems, because it's the same like if we hold a baby on our arm, most probably we won't talk to that baby like to our business partner. Why? Because we naturally attune to the baby. We change the rhythm of our voice, the speed of how we talk, our whole attunement changes. That's a naturally built-in function of our nervous system. That's the basis of parenting. And in the work with clients and people, we can use the same function. We just change it a bit into a professional setup. And so we all carry that function inside, that our nervous system is actually a very sophisticated attunement tool. But where I carry trauma, I cannot specifically attune to you. That's why the ongoing work of everybody that accompanies people, clients, or works with us coaching clients is so important, because where my trauma resides, I cannot feel my clients, and that's where I put effort onto the process. And so on that level, I need supervision, I need a peer-to-peer context, I need exchange, and I need to be very honest that when I have a difficult client, it's my developmental work to do. And if I am humble enough to live that way, I think we are all just growing. It's just a very fast developmental track. So these were just two things, but I see there are some hands up.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for this moment, for your talk, Thomas, for the richness of the presence of everybody. I can feel all the energy from different continents. So I feel like in the center, surrounded by love, compassion, and desire to be a better human being. So I want to give thanks for that experience. The second thing that I want to introduce myself as a traumatized person in recovery. So it's not that I am a PhD or I'm a professor or I'm a traumatized person in recovery, a wounded healer. So that's grounded me in whatever I'm trying to do. We talk in our group, who was a beautiful experience, about triggers that you mentioned. And we remember together a lot of soundtracks in our brain system that say it's not enough, you should be better, that's not what we expect from you, that's not the way to perform, whatever, a lot of messages that are in our unconscious system. So my question, do you have any specific technique to work with these soundtracks that have to be reshape or embrace or put another notes to make another different type of music?
That's
Thank you.
Yes, I do have. And I want to honor also what you started with, because you said the wounded healer, like trauma recovery turns us into a remedy. And that's a very powerful thing, you said, that we should all remember that if we work through and heal our own trauma, the healed version of our trauma means we become a remedy or a healing agent in the social networks where we live. That's very beautiful. Trauma is like light in the trauma turned around as a remedy, and then it becomes a healing agent. That's very beautiful. And so thank you for that. And yes, so I need to build a short context for the answer. In the trauma work, we know that when an organism can develop healthily, so then the physical, emotional, mental, relational, spiritual expression is unified. When trauma hits a system, there is like some kind of internal fragmentation, like when a glass cracks. And so the data flow, the intra-body communication is kind of hurt. That means that often the mental function becomes like a top-down control system over nature. our emotions and the body, the biological system. So the mental function is actually as part of the suppression system. It's like a domination of nature. So that's why when these voices come up, it's not enough. It's not good enough. So they look like mental processes, but when that happens, I always ask, okay, when this thought comes up, what's actually happening in your body? And then to look, oh, what's actually my physical, emotional state when I think those thoughts? And maybe at the beginning, maybe I feel something, maybe I'm afraid, and that is the record, the stuck CD that is protecting me from feeling the fear. Or I feel numb, I don't know at the beginning. And when I keep exploring my physical, emotional experience, I actually go deeper into what keeps this thought process looping. Because there must be something in my physical, emotional experience that is connected to this record that you were speaking about. And so revealing the energetic flow in my emotions and my body helps me to ease the intensity of this looping thought, because the thought patterns are just a distraction, but they can help me to connect to the energetic charge that drives it. And another part that I think relates to that question is, I think as humanity, we need to always keep in mind that we are coming out of a long era of power over hierarchies. Even in many families, education, because many parents were traumatized, are not relationship-based, they were often power-based. That the parents are like a top-down power imposition where the parents got to their limits to relate to their children. So when the children trigger the parents says, no, this is how it is. And so that there is like that authority is often experienced as a limitation of my freedom is a side effect of power over hierarchies. And competence-based and relationship-based systemic hierarchies, they're very different. They are power with. So they are empowering everybody. Even if there are different layers of leadership, they are very related to each other. So there's a data flow through the system up and down, which in power over hierarchies, the fuel is often fear. And in power with hierarchies, the fuel is creativity. And I believe many of us still carry the side effects of detoxing power over hierarchies and coming much more to leadership and empowering leadership. That means that leadership is absolutely for me. Even hierarchy in organization is absolutely for me because it wants me at my best. But that's not how many people experience hierarchies and authorities. Many people are afraid of authorities, but that's a sign that we carry a lot of history, like unintegrated history in our bodies, nervous systems, emotions, that are afraid of hierarchies. And I think that's something we have to detox and slowly integrate the trauma of that overpowering, and also often of parenting, because it needs a lot of maturity in a parent to not do that with the children. And I think these loops are like a composition of these two things that or maybe more, but these two things I think important components of this. I'm not good enough. I'm not. And then we look also often of how should I be versus how am I? And with this, I'm belonging to the context anyway. But that's not how everybody feels. We're often looking, how should I be to belong to this context? Not that I'm belonging anyway. And then I have a relational dynamic that helps me to learn within a system and grow within a system. So these are just a few thoughts. I don't know if that's helpful for you. I think there are many levels. It's not a simple answer to that, because it's a complex question. When we unpack it, it's pretty complex. But like some cornerstones, and maybe then there is another context where this can be explored deeper. So if we take leadership development seriously, and I'm very committed to the wisdom of leadership, then every challenge I meet as a leader is my teacher. But I need to be careful with that sentence. But that I'm committed to find out, even if I meet somebody that has kind of whatever, we need to define this, maybe clearly like a narcissistic disorder, then still it's hard for me to navigate, set clear boundaries, be in relationship with a person that expresses these kind of traits. So there's a dynamic in myself that can grow through that encounter, and I can get some maybe supervision and some maybe also learn some things, training in how to be more equipped to meet that kind of personality structure. So that's number one. Number two is also that we, especially when there is abuse, in like when trauma leads to abuse, there needs to be an individual response to that from the leadership, or a leader that sees this on the team, in an organization, in the community. And it needs to have clear boundaries, because abusive behavior leads to more traumatization. So we can't just let that happen. So it needs a taking care and the protection also around it, which means if there is an openness on the level of an abusive personality to learn and take care of that, so then great. If not, then that person cannot stay in certain functions where they hurt other people. So that, I think, is on the level of leadership, but it's also on the level of organization. What kind of organizational sensors or responsiveness do we have to make sure that abusive behaviors do not continue to traumatize or re-traumatize other people? Because so there needs to be a kind of a protocol or some kind of response of the organization. I think the more healthy an organization is, the easier it is to respond to it. The more it's ingrained in the organization as something untaken care of, the more it prevails. So sometimes we also need to change habits in the organization in order to create a structure, and like a structure that takes care of it. And we also have many ways in the meanwhile how there is support for people that express some abusive behavior that really is helpful, that doesn't have to continue. We know how to take care of them, and we know how to support people. So bringing in the support that is needed to take care of that kind of personality structure is not so difficult. So then we need to see why if it persists, why are we not taking care of that? What is the systemic learning that's needed? Because we know how to take care of it, we know the treatments for it. So why would that not happen? And so I think there are different layers, but in my responsiveness, if I'm grounded in myself and open, then more difficult personality structures are less difficult for me. And if they are, then I need to also use this as a learning and make sure that there is no collateral damage being done. I think that's very important. Otherwise, there's a lot of pain being created that can be prevented. So, but I don't know enough about specific situations. That's why what I say might not fully meet the context now. But I think there's something very important about re-traumatization and how to minimize that, and then also find the right support for somebody in order to develop and grow from that situation, and be generous, loving, but also be able to set healthy boundaries. Sometimes is an expression of love.
Thank you. There's so many beautiful comments coming in. I wonder, Sandra, if we could share the poem.
A blessing in a time of violence, which is to say, this blessing is always, which is to say, there is no place this blessing does not long to cry out in lament, to weep its words in sorrow, to scream its lines in sacred rage, which is to say, there is no day this blessing ceases to whisper into the ear of the dying, the despairing, the terrified, which is to say, there is no moment this blessing refuses to sing itself into the heart of the hated and the hateful, the victim and the victimizer, with every last ounce of hope it has. Which is to say, there is none that can stop it, none that can halt its course, none that will still its cadence, none that will delay its rising, none that can keep it from springing forth from the mouths of us who hope, from the hands of us who act, from the hearts of us who love, from the feet of us who will not cease our stubborn, aching marching. Marching until this blessing has spoken its final word, until this blessing has breathed its benediction in every place, in every tongue. Peace, peace, peace. So that's a poem by Jan Richardson that we thought we could end this gathering with. And we invite your prayers for the Holy Land, for Lebanon, for Israel, for Palestine, and all the places in the world that are suffering from war.
Thank you, Sandra. And Thomas, we thank you sincerely for your presence, for your calling to this work. And we look forward to more. So we look forward to hearing back from you who have participated as to your experience, and to also where you'd like to continue to learn and grow along these particular paths, and how we can be of support to you. Thomas, any last words?
First of all, I wanted to thank you and everybody who made it, also Virginia, for bringing us together and making this possible. And thank you for the lovely presence, everybody. There was a lovely holding space and a warm, loving presence here in the space. So that is very beautiful. So thank you, everybody.